more chairs. I was thinking, we're not going to need that many chairs, but we do. Thank you very much for all coming. It's such a nice day. You could be at home putting up your storm windows or washing your cars, so you chose to be here instead. I'm very flattered. And, it's really nice. You know, back in the day when I first started going out to talk to people about my books, my husband would say, I'd come back in the evening and say to my husband, oh, we had a great crowd. We had 15 people. I said, it's kind of increased since then. Even then, though, he'd say to me, well, doesn't it make you nervous having to stand up in front of all these totally strange people and talk about your books? I think he meant total strangers rather than total strangers. But I said, well, you know, it might, but I've been a university professor for a long time. Said if I can keep people awake at 8 o'clock in the morning talking about human anatomy and physiology, I could probably keep them awake at 8 o'clock in the evening if they came to hear me. Back then, I would walk into an auditorium full of at least this many people because human anatomy and physiology was a big class. Everybody took it. It was popular with everyone, including the football team. They all took it because they thought it would be easy. They always sat in the front row, and I'd walk in the first day of class. They'd all be there sound asleep, these large inanimate blobs of flesh. Walk up to the edge of the platform and say, well, this morning, gentlemen, we're going to discuss the history of contraception. Then I'll start blinking. In days of old, when nights were cold and condoms not invented, they wrapped old socks around their cocks and babies were prevented. Football team too. Pardon me if I keep walking around here. I'm used to walking back and forth in front of the crowd. You know what I'm talking to as the students or whatever. But it'll work regardless. You know, I've always known that I was supposed to be a writer from the time I was 8 years old or so. But I came from a very conservative family background, and my dad used to say to me, well, you're such a poor judge of character, you're bound to marry some bum. He said, so be sure you get a good education so you can support your children. But what was going on at home, I thought perhaps I would not announce that I wanted to write novels because I understood this was sort of financially risky. And so I got into science. You know, I liked science, I was good at it. My PhD dissertation was a 400-page opus entitled Best Site Selection in Opinion J, Germarinus cyanocephalus. Or as my husband says, why birds build nests where they do and who cares anyway. I still wanted to write books, and when I turned 35, I said to myself, well, you know, Mozart was dead at 36, maybe you better get a move on here. And so I said, all right, on my next birthday, I will begin writing a book. Because up to this point, I had written all kinds of things, you know, all the stuff you have to write while getting a PhD in quantitative behavioral ecology, a master's degree in marine biology. My thesis for that was agonistic interactions in the hermit crab, which is almost as exciting. For that one, I had to torture hermit crabs with a soldering iron. Guys who live in borrowed shells. That's because they have very naked rear ends, that they're very vulnerable, and so to a hermit crab, the most important thing in life is his shell. So I was checking to see whether being deprived of food would make them more likely to shell fight, because they do something where they bang their shells together, and then the one who gives up first has to hop out of his shell, and the winner tries on both till he decides which he wants, and he walks off with a better shell, and the loser has to take the other one. But they will fight over food, you know, just, you know, clawing at each other and all that. So I was checking to see if, you know, depriving one of food would make him shell fight more aggressively, or if making him live in an inferior shell would make him fight for food more aggressively and all that. Well, it turned out that nothing is more important than a shell, and so it doesn't matter how many days they've been without food, they'll go for the shell rather than the food, no difference. But it is so important that they won't get out of their shells to start with. So in order to make them get into smaller shells to try it out, I had to put a soldering iron to the shell they were in until it got too hot and they would jump out. It was very mean, but I didn't tell them. And I didn't give them back all their original shells when we were done testing them. Anyway, it's been an interesting life as a scientist. And people always say, well, how did you get from being a scientist to being a novelist? I said, well, you see, I wrote a book. That's all I don't have to get license for anything. Anyway, as I say, I've written all kinds of things, including, you know, scientific articles and popular science articles and theses and doctoral dissertations and textbooks and tutorials for software documentation, anything anybody would pay me for, essentially. because while I did not marry a bum, I married a very nice man, who I still have 38 years later. I did marry a man who quit work 3 months after our first child was born in order to start his own business. And I do have to say that in terms of financial stability, there's not that much to choose between an entrepreneur and a bum. So for our first few years, while his business was getting going, I was our sole support, and they don't pay assistant professors all that much. So this is where I took to writing software reviews, because along the way I had sort of slid from being an ecologist into being a, quote, expert in scientific computation. It's really easy to be an expert if there's only 6 people in the world who do what you do. That was my profession at the time. So I was, as I say. And so when the need to earn extra money arrived, because we did keep on having children, I said, well, it's got to be something I could do at home without quitting my university job. So maybe I better write something. I said, well, what can I do better than anybody else? I can write about scientific software. And so I wrote a query letter to the editors of Byte and InfoWorld and all these computer press magazines, and I sent with it a copy of a scientific journal that I had founded at my university called Science Software Quarterly, which was for scientists who used computers in their work. I also sent along a copy of a Walt Disney comic book that I'd done for their educational media division entitled Nutrition Adventures with Orange Bird. Through a short query letter, it said, "Dear Sirs, as you can see from the enclosed, you won't find anyone who knows more about scientific and technical software than I do, and at the same time I can write so as to appeal to a broad popular audience." And so this got me immediate assignments, and within a year I was making as much freelancing for the computer press as I was working at the university, which, as I say, just goes to show how little they pay assistant professors. But the point here is that nobody ever showed me how to write software reviews or doctoral dissertations or Walt Disney comic books. I had just looked at a few and tried an example, and if it didn't look quite right, I poked it till I did. And I said, well, you know, you've been reading novels for 30-odd years, surely if you write one, you'll recognize it. And said, okay, so I'm going to write a novel just to learn how. I'm not going to show it to anyone, I'm not going to tell anyone what I'm doing, it's just for me to learn how. And then I can decide, do I really want to do this for real? I've been thinking all these years that I do, but you know, maybe I'm wrong. Find out here. And so I said, okay, what shall I write? This was a practice novel of mine, so it didn't really matter. And I thought, well, you know, I read everything and lots of it. I said, but you maybe read more mysteries than anything else. Maybe I should write mystery. And I said, no, mysteries have plots. I'm not sure I can do that. And so I said, what's the easiest possible thing I could write for practice? No point making it hard. And I thought for a bit. I said, well, for me, maybe a historical novel would be the easiest thing to write. Because I was a research professor, I knew my way around a library. I said, it seems easier to look things up than to make them up. And if I turn out to have no imagination, I can steal things from the historical record. Actually works pretty well. So I said, fine, historical novel. Well, where shall I set this? Because I have no formal background in history, just the 6 hours of Western civilization they make you take as an undergraduate. So any time would do as well as another. I'd have to look it all up anyway. So I was looking for a congenial time and place in which to set this novel. And while I was thinking about it, I happened to see a really old Doctor Who rerun on public television. I see some of you are familiar with Doctor Who, for the ones who are not laughing. It's a really old, really long-running show that's done in the UK, where originally it was a fantasy show for children. It's now gotten substantially more adult. It's been running for 60-odd years. And luckily the Doctor regenerates periodically, so that's not a problem. But the premise of the show is that the Doctor of the title is a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey who travels through space and time having adventures. And along the way, he picks up various companions from different periods of Earth's history. On this really old show, which has to have been done 50 years ago, he had picked up a Scotsman, a young Scotsman from 1745. And this was an 18, 19-year-old young man who appeared in his kilt. And I said, well, that's kind of fetching. I found myself still thinking about this the next day. In church. And I said, well, you want to write a book, it doesn't really matter where you set it. The important thing is pick a point and get started. So you're fine, Scotland, 18th century. So that's where I began, knowing nothing about Scotland or the 18th century, having no plot, no outline, and no characters. Nothing but the rather vague images conjured up by the notion of a man in a kilt. Which is, of course, very powerful and compelling image. In fact, the next to last Outlander novel, Breath of Snow and Ashes, was a very lucky book for me. It opened at #1 on bestseller lists of several different countries' newspapers, And it also won me a few awards, including the Corina International Prize for Fiction, which is totally cool. And I got to go to Germany to accept this. Well, while I was there, the German publisher had me interviewed by absolutely everybody in the German press, every half hour all day for a week. And toward the end of this rather exhausting process, I was talking to this nice gentleman from a literary journal. He said, I read all of your books, you know, your imagery is so wonderful, your narrative drive is just tremendous. Your characters are so three-dimensional. And I'm thinking, yes, go on. He said, he paused and said, there's just this one thing, I wonder, could you explain to me what is the appeal of a man in a kilt? Okay, I wasn't German. I was really tired, I might not have said it, but I looked at it for a minute and I said, well, I suppose it's the idea that you could be up against a wall with him in a minute. That's a very powerful and compelling. In fact, last summer, while I was, no, summer before last, when I was in Edinburgh, I was invited to a gathering of Clan Fraser, which was very flattering. It was the first gathering they'd had since the old Lord Lovat had died, 12 years before, and the new young Lord Lovat was now, kind of prepared to take over leadership and all that. He was only 18 when his grandfather died and landed him with the title. Anyway, it was a lovely occasion and all that. Well, the present Lord Lovat is 32 years old. He's very good looking, and he's about 7 feet tall. All the Frasers are very tall. I was thinking about that. Anyway, this very nice looking young man comes up to me in the village hall, introduces himself, welcomes me, and is making polite conversation, asking me about my books. Well, as I said, he's 7 feet tall, I'm 5'2". So I find myself explaining the appeal of a man in a kilt to this foreign. Very powerful and compelling image, as I say. But that was all I had to start with, was the image of a man in a kilt. So I went instantly to the library and began looking things up. And heard about Scotland in the 18th century. Now, the only thing I knew about writing novels at this point was that they should have conflict. So I was looking for sources of conflict in Scotland in the 18th century. Well, you don't do that for very long without running smack into Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Rising of the 45. I said, well, that looks like a lot of conflict, that'll be fine. And I said, no, I just have a lot of Scotsmen, of course, because of the kilt factor. But what we essentially have here is English versus Scots. So if I think I should have a female character to play off these guys, and we'll have sexual tension, that's good, it's conflict. I said, so if I make this potential heroine an English woman, they will have lots of conflict. So about the third day of writing, I introduced this female character, and I had no idea who she was, what she was going to do in the plot, or how she got into the story, but I just loosed her into a cottage full of Scotsmen to see what she'd do. As she walked in, they're all crouched around the hearth, muttering to each other, and they all turned around and stared. I was thinking, why does she look funny? What's going on here? Anyway, one of them drew himself slowly to his feet, and he said, my name is Dougal Mackenzie, and who will you be? Without my stopping to think, I just typed, my name is Claire Elizabeth Beecham, and who the hell are you? I said, well, you don't sound at all like an 18th century person. So I fought with her for several pages, trying to beat her into shape and make her talk like an 18th century woman. But she wasn't having any of this. She just kept making smart-ass modern remarks. And she also took over and started telling the story herself. And I said, well, I'm not going to fight with you all the way through this book. I said, no one's ever going to see this. It doesn't matter what bizarre thing I do. I said, go ahead and be modern. I'll figure out how you got there later. So it's all her fault that there's time travel in these books. Well, of course, having decided that, obviously anything wins, so anything does. And consequently, you get the Loch Ness Monster and a few other entertaining things in that book. But I must digress at this point, as though I haven't already. There's a reason why I write long books. It's because I like digressions. Let's digress back to the writing software reviews for the computer press. Because about a year before I decided to write a book for practice, I had received a software package from Byte magazine, and they said, we want you to review this. We're also sending you a trial membership to CompuServe, because this vendor has a support forum for their software on CompuServe, and they'd like you to mention it in your review. I said, well, cool. Now, this was the mid-'80s, probably 86 or so. This was long before the days of America Online or chat rooms. The World Wide Web, as we know it, didn't exist.